We're looking at a two-phase construction site in many of the so-called Inca stone monuments.
This rock weighs about 20 tons. This is minuscule compared to many of the rocks at Sacsayhuaman.
In southern Peru, there is a wall that refuses to behave like an ordinary wall. Its stones are heavier than trucks, yet they were joined so precisely that, even 500 years later, a knife blade still cannot be pushed into the seams. The structure has endured earthquakes that destroyed almost everything constructed after it. Researchers have examined this place for 300 years, but they have explained surprisingly little. Then a team attempted something no one had done before. They supplied an artificial intelligence system with data from the entire wall and asked it to identify whatever generations of human observers had failed to notice.
Is that the Inca constructed Sacsayhuaman less than 1,000 years ago.
The answer produced by the machine was not what disturbed the researchers most. What troubled them was the place where the system decided to begin, where it looked first. When people approach this wall, they naturally focus on the stones. Of course they do. The stones are the spectacle. Enormous golden brown blocks glow beneath the thin mountain sunlight. At dusk, they cast long shadows and challenge anyone looking at them to believe that human beings could ever have moved them. The stones seem to be the entire point. Yet when the machine received all the available information, it did the one thing that no visitor in 5 centuries had apparently thought to do. It ignored the stones. Instead, it examined the holes around them, the seams, the joints, the empty spaces, and the places where 2 colossal blocks meet and lock together. That unusual decision to study the gaps before studying the rock is the thread we are going to follow. Because once that thread is pulled, the reassuring story normally told about this place begins to unravel.
Technology to quarry giant blocks of stone.
The site is Sacsayhuaman, located on the high ridge overlooking Cusco. If you have ever seen a single image of ancient Peru, there is a good chance you have already seen its famous zigzag terraces made from seemingly impossible stonework. The official explanation appears orderly enough when written down. Sacsayhuaman was a great fortress, a ceremonial center, or perhaps both. It was supposedly raised during the reign of the Inca Emperor Pachacuti by thousands of organized workers using ramps, ropes, and repeated grinding, rubbing one stone against another until the blocks finally fitted together. That account has been repeated so many times that most people accept it without examining the details. But the more closely the wall is studied, the less securely that explanation stands. And for the first time, we now possess tools capable of examining it more closely than the unaided human eye ever could. The problem of scale. Begin with the physical reality of the stones, because the numbers are difficult to absorb. The largest blocks in the lowest terrace are estimated to weigh far more than 100 tons, and some estimates place their weight considerably higher. Forget the figure for a moment and imagine the object itself. Picture one limestone block taller than a man standing on another man's shoulders, as wide as a delivery vehicle, and so thick that you could not wrap your arms and a rope around it. The block is not merely sitting on the ground. It has been placed inside the wall. Its lower surface was shaped to rest against the stones beneath it, while its upper surface was carved with recesses designed to receive the blocks above. There is no mortar. Nothing fills the space between one stone and the next, except the accuracy of the cut. That precise arrangement has survived centuries of seismic activity, including earthquakes powerful enough to fracture modern concrete. Now, ask the question that the neat official explanation tends to pass over. How did that stone reach its present position? The nearest geological sources matching the stone are located many kilometers away. These are not easy level kilometers. They cross mountainous ground, ravines, and steep inclines that would force a modern truck carrying a heavy load to struggle in low gear. The pre-Columbian Andes had no draft animals powerful enough to pull such masses. Wheels were not commonly used for transporting heavy loads. Iron tools were unavailable. The conventional answer is familiar. The blocks were moved with ramps, rollers, ropes made from grass fibers, and the coordinated strength of thousands of workers operating in shifts over many seasons. That explanation is not inherently impossible. Human beings can accomplish astonishing things when they organize themselves. This was their achievement, not some gift borrowed from elsewhere, and we should never diminish their abilities. However, transporting a stone is one challenge. Positioning it is another. And positioning it is the more difficult problem. Pulling a 100-ton block up an incline would represent an extraordinary triumph of planning and labor. But lowering that same block into a wall so that its uneven underside settles perfectly against the irregular upper surfaces of stones already in place, with seams too narrow to accept even a sheet of paper, is a completely different level of difficulty. You cannot make small adjustments to a 100-ton stone by gently tapping it, nor can you easily lift it out again, remove one high area, and then lower it back for another trial fitting. At Sacsayhuaman, one detail in particular causes engineers to become quiet. The most enormous stones are frequently among the most accurately fitted. That is precisely the reverse of what logic would predict. As a block becomes larger, fitting it should become more difficult. Here, however, the largest blocks often have the finest joints. Remember that fact. It will return later, and when it does, it will no longer feel merely unusual. It will feel colder. The holes rather than the rock. For 3 centuries, this site was studied by one careful human observer at a time. A researcher might devote an entire career to one portion of the wall and die before thoroughly examining the next. The surviving record is not contained in one complete and organized archive. It is divided among multiple languages and measurement systems. It survives in hand-drawn diagrams, field notes, faded photographs, modern photogrammetry, and laser-generated point clouds containing billions of individual coordinates.
Who descended from the sky a long time ago and imparted the first knowledge of anything.
No individual person could hold all these forms of evidence in one mind at the same moment. That is what changed. The machine could process everything simultaneously. It was also given an instruction that human beings rarely manage to follow completely. Approach the evidence without loyalty to any preferred explanation. Do not favor the fortress theory. Do not favor the temple theory. Do not protect the pride of any nation. Report only what the geometry requires. The system began with the joints. That was because the joints are not simply narrow. They are narrow in a very specific manner. The surfaces do not merely press flatly against one another. They bend, curve, and wrap around neighboring stones in 3 dimensions, locking together like puzzle pieces designed by something capable of seeing inside the rock before the first piece was removed. Cutting one straight seam between 2 stones is already difficult. Creating a seam that bends and interlocks in every direction between blocks heavier than a house, without any discovered metal tools capable of doing the work, and without an easy way to repeatedly test the fit, is not just a demonstration of patience, it is mathematics. It represents knowledge of weight, pressure, angle, and structural force expressed through solid stone. The significance becomes clearer when thousands of joints are examined together instead of one at a time. According to the analysis, the disturbing discovery was that these joints may not be random. They appear to repeat. They seem to obey rules. Their curves follow certain proportions, and those same proportions reappear in stones believed to have been quarried kilometers apart and dragged up the mountain. That observation alone should make you pause. Yet it is still the least alarming part of the pattern. Once the system had identified possible rules within the spacing, it stopped asking only how the wall had been assembled. It began asking what the spacing was intended to accomplish. A question of the sky. I need to be completely honest because this is the point where established fact and speculation move very close to one another. You deserve to know exactly where the boundary lies. Archaeoastronomy is a legitimate field of research. Across the Andes, scholars have spent decades documenting the fact that Inca builders carefully observed the heavens. The festival of Inti Raymi, the great celebration of the sun, was connected to a calendar involving solstices and celestial risings. That is not a fringe claim. It is widely accepted. The Inca measured time through the sky, and they constructed places designed to capture or mark those celestial events. The spacing within the wall therefore raises a natural question. Suppose you stood at one fixed location in front of the lowest terrace, perhaps where an observer might have stood during the reign of Pachacuti. If you followed the sun throughout the year, would the wall's major joints align with the points along the horizon where the sun rises during the solstices? Those are the 2 moments each year when the sun reaches its most distant limits and appears, for one suspended instant, to stop before beginning its return. I will not claim that this has been conclusively demonstrated. I have not seen a peer-reviewed investigation proving that these specific joints form a precise solstice grid. You should be suspicious of anyone who presents that idea as established fact. However, it is exactly the kind of question that becomes possible when a machine can analyze every joint at once. Then there is a more difficult version of the same possibility. It is the version that transforms an interesting curiosity into something capable of keeping you awake. The moon does not move across the horizon in the same way as the sun. Its rising position shifts through a long and gradual pattern. It reaches its furthest northern and southern limits only at the completion of a cycle lasting approximately 18.5 years. This phenomenon is known as the lunar standstill. The unforgiving part is that the moon offers no obvious announcement when the event arrives. There is no marker, signal, or single unmistakable night when it visibly stops and reverses. To recognize the cycle, observers must record where the moon rises year after year. They must compare the furthest rising point of one winter with a corresponding point from another winter so distant that they may barely remember it. This type of knowledge must be transmitted between people and generations, because one ordinary span of attention can scarcely contain it. Therefore, if specialists ever demonstrate that a lunar standstill alignment was deliberately built into a wall like this, and that remains something qualified experts would need to establish, it would imply that people systematically observed the moon for nearly 2 decades. The person who began the record might not even have survived long enough to witness the cycle's completion. The selective test. There is one honest method for distinguishing an authentic astronomical pattern from imaginative pattern seeking. You should understand this test so that no one can mislead you, including me. A structure this large will inevitably point towards something. Choose any joint. Extend an imaginary line outward from it. Eventually, that line will intersect a star, a sunrise, a mountain notch, or some other feature, because the sky is crowded and coincidence is generous. A wall in which every line supposedly aligns with something proves nothing. The only meaningful result would be selective. Certain joints would carry significance, while others would not. The meaningful joints would also need to cluster precisely around the important locations, where relevant celestial events occur on the horizon. Chance creates alignments everywhere. A deliberate record is selective. That is the standard every serious astronomical claim about this wall must satisfy. It is also the standard that many dramatic versions of the story quietly avoid. Therefore, when you hear claims that the analysis identified meaningful joints grouped around significant directions, while ordinary joints pointed nowhere important, treat that as a claim rather than a conclusion. Specialists would need to compare those alignments with the ancient sky. This matters because the heavens slowly shift over thousands of years. The test is valid only if it reconstructs the horizon and celestial positions as they appeared when the wall was made. The relevant zone may not be the part of the sky directly overhead. I am explaining what a successful test would require so that whenever someone presents one impressive alignment, you will know what question must immediately follow. What about all the joints that point nowhere? If the wall ever passed that test, we would have to confront another unsettling thought. People who visit and photograph these terraces are drawn by the size of the stones. Yet, across all the years of cameras and worn pathways, perhaps none of them stood in the exact fixed location where an ancient observer might have stood and looked beyond the wall rather than at it. Perhaps they failed to watch the notch in the mountains where the sun would rise on the longest night of the year. The wall may never have been merely a wall. It may also have functioned as an instrument directed toward the sky, waiting for someone to understand its dial. If the thought of a wall standing silently for 5 centuries and suddenly presenting questions we cannot answer draws you in, subscribe before we continue. Everything becomes stranger from this point forward, and I want you to be here when the next location is entered into the system. Sacsayhuaman is not the only wall of this kind. Only now are such places beginning to be examined in this way. The next file is already being prepared. 2 jobs at once. We now reach an idea that sounds exaggerated until you learn that it is connected to something demonstrably real several hundred kilometers away. In the Peruvian highlands stands a much older complex known as Chavin de Huantar. At Chavin, the evidence concerning acoustics is not simply legend. It has been measured and published. Its builders intentionally manipulated sound through stone passageways and channels. These spaces carried and altered the blasts of conch shell trumpets, creating effects capable of confusing, overwhelming, and making a person standing inside lose a stable sense of self. Ancient Andean builders clearly understood that architecture could operate as an instrument. The acoustic question at Sacsayhuaman therefore does not emerge from nothing. It is reasonable to investigate whether the spacing within these enormous curved terraces also affects the movement of sound. The stones could be modeled in the same way an acoustic engineer models a concert hall. Researchers could test how a voice projected from a certain position, a drum struck in a specific location, or wind passing through the openings would move, collect, and fade across the open areas in front of the largest blocks. Again, I need to maintain the boundary between evidence and interpretation. I have not seen a completed and published acoustic study of this kind for Sacsayhuaman itself. According to the claimed analysis, the terraces may concentrate sound within a frequency range so low that it is felt in the chest more strongly than it is heard. This is the same kind of frequency that modern engineers sometimes pursue when they want a room to feel sacred or overwhelming. At present, however, that is an interpretation rather than an established discovery. It should be treated as a hypothesis. Yet because deliberate acoustic design has been proven at Chavin, this is not an untested idea that can simply be dismissed with laughter. That is why it threatens one's peace of mind. If this interpretation proved correct, the astronomical spacing and acoustic spacing would not represent two unrelated accomplishments. The same measurements would be performing two functions simultaneously. The distances aligning the wall with positions on the horizon would also be the distances tuning the stone. Changing one system would damage the other. That would mean the result was not accidental. Someone would have needed to solve both problems at once, either mentally or through some planning method that has not survived before the first block was cut. I cannot tell you that this is true. I can tell you that, if it were true, it would overturn many assumptions about the intellectual and technical capabilities of the people who built this place. That is why the question deserves careful investigation rather than exaggerated shouting. The wrong stones. One feature of the masonry is disturbing even without any astronomical or acoustic theory. Personally, I find it more difficult to forget than the ideas involving the sky or sound. The wall is not constructed entirely from one type of stone. To an ordinary viewer, the blocks appear to form one weathered gray mass, their surfaces made similar by centuries of rainfall. Petrography, however, examines the mineral composition of rock. It can help identify what type of stone a block is, provide clues about where it originated, and indicate how energy passes through it. The unusual pattern frequently discussed is this. By every practical standard, several of the most important blocks appear to have been the least sensible choices. Some are denser, some are heavier, some came from more distant sources. They were moved up the slope at a cost so enormous that it is difficult to imagine, even though more convenient stone was available nearby. The builders did not always select the easiest block. At times, they chose the most difficult and expensive stone and placed it in one exact location. It was not positioned where convenience suggested it should go. It was placed precisely there. The poetic explanation is that the builders selected stone in the same way a maker of musical instruments selects wood, refusing the easier material in favor of the piece that produced the correct response. That interpretation must be treated cautiously because it depends partly on the unproven acoustic hypothesis. But even after removing the romance, one straightforward question remains. Why accept that additional cost? Why transport the heavier, more difficult stone past an easier source? Human beings generally choose the expensive option instead of the cheap one because they believe the difference matters. We simply do not yet understand what mattered to these builders. When the cost was so great, ignorance of their reason becomes haunting in itself. Keep the question unresolved. It leads toward the next pattern the machine reportedly identified. Shape of the valley. The analysis eventually widened its view. It stopped examining the wall one stone at a time and began treating the entire landscape in the way a person reads a face from the far side of a room. Instead of concentrating on individual features, it looked for the complete expression. The system combined the terraces, distant foundations, and scattered structures that generations of mapmakers had cataloged as separate or unrelated. It placed all of them within one shared frame. Then it asked the simplest question it had raised so far. Is there an overall shape here, not a form contained within one building, but a structure created by all the buildings together when viewed from above, a perspective no person standing on the ground could have experienced directly. What the analysis reportedly identified was not a literal picture. It was not something as crude as a giant drawing carved across the hillside. Instead, it found a possible relationship. Angles and distances seemed to connect structures positioned so far from one another that no single builder could simply have walked between them repeatedly during a normal working life. A line might extend from a foundation on one ridge toward a doorway on another. Where two such lines crossed, a third structure appeared to sit at the intersection, almost as though it had been placed to mark the meeting point of two concepts that no observer on the ground could have mentally contained at once. If the analysis is correct, the geometry exists at the scale of the landscape. Understanding it would require a bird's-eye perspective, the mind of a surveyor, or the processing ability of a machine. The pattern may have remained openly visible for as long as maps of the site have existed. Yet it was invisible in the same way a word becomes invisible when you are standing inside one of its letters. This remains interpretation. I want to state clearly that valley-wide alignments are exactly the kind of pattern capable of deceiving an enthusiastic human observer, or a system designed to detect relationships. For that reason, specialists would need to confirm the geometry using precise measurements on the ground. Still, consider what the result would mean if it survived rigorous testing. It would suggest that the builders were not constructing several separate monuments. They were constructing one monument, and that monument was the size of the valley. It would further imply that they could establish position and direction across rivers, ridges, and great distances, with a level of accuracy normally associated with instruments they supposedly did not possess. That possibility forces us toward the question the entire investigation has approached without directly naming. If their abilities were so advanced, why does the historical record appear to show decline? The skill runs backward. This is the part that may keep you awake. We normally assume that technical ability advances over time. Early craftspeople struggle. Later generations improve their methods. Knowledge becomes more refined as it is passed forward. Following that logic, the earliest masonry should be the least sophisticated, while the latest work should display the highest precision. At Sacsayhuaman and comparable locations, however, observers have long noted a pattern that seems to run in the opposite direction. The most extraordinary and precisely joined megalithic construction often appears to belong to the oldest levels. Above it, later builders added smaller, rougher masonry, sometimes relying on mortar. The giants are at the bottom. The lesser work rests on top. The finest construction appears oldest. The skill seems to move backward. Honesty is essential here, so this qualification must be included. The dating of these different building phases is genuinely disputed. Some of the strongest versions of this claim are promoted by people attempting to sell a particular theory. Nevertheless, the underlying observation is real enough that serious researchers continue to debate it. If the pattern is correct, it implies something deeply uncomfortable. The people who came later were not learning the technique and improving it. They inherited it and gradually became worse at performing it. They may have been copying something they no longer fully understood, attempting to reproduce a line that their ancestors had once cut perfectly, but failing to reach the same standard. It would be like tracing a signature written in a language you cannot read. That is a fundamentally different historical story from the one we usually tell ourselves. We prefer to imagine knowledge as a line rising steadily upward. This would be a declining line. A high point at the beginning, followed by a slow and extended process of forgetting. Forgetting is difficult to detect. Unlike invasion, conquest, or catastrophe, it leaves almost no obvious evidence. It leaves only work that is slightly less confident than the work beside it. It leaves objects made by people who may have known that their hands were less capable than the hands of those who came before, yet continued cutting stone, because they were desperately trying to preserve something already disappearing. Imagine two groups of tool marks on one block. One is the clean line of a master. Beside it is the mark of a later craftsperson, attempting to reproduce the same line and failing. The two makers are separated by centuries. The later one possesses less skill. They were not discovering the technique, they were losing it. And they may have known they were losing it. That leaves one question worth asking. If you realized that knowledge of such importance was disappearing, what would you do with what remained?